The map room. Captain Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the Pacific Fleet Headquarters building, staring at the radio intercept logs that had accumulated over the past 72 hours. It was the morning of December 5th, 1941, and something felt profoundly wrong. For 6 months, his intelligence team had tracked Japanese warship movements through intercepted radio transmissions, building a mental map of the Imperial Navy's disposition across the Pacific. But now, in the space of a single week, that map had developed blank spaces where Japan's carrier fleet should be. 4 aircraft carriers, possibly 6, had simply vanished from American knowledge. "Still nothing from Akagi?" he asked the young ensign at the decryption table. "No, sir. No carrier traffic at all. They changed call signs twice in November, then went dark." Rochefort pulled out his daily report for Admiral Kimmel. He had written these reports every morning since June, when President Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii, a move meant to intimidate Japan into backing off from China. Each report attempted to answer the same question. Where are the Japanese carriers? Today, he would have to write something he had never written before. Unknown. He thought about the morning briefing. Kimmel would ask, as he always did, whether Pearl Harbor was safe. And Rochefort would answer, as he always did, that yes, they had time. That any Japanese move would come in Southeast Asia. That Hawaii was too far, too fortified, too implausible a target. But the blank spaces on his mental map whispered otherwise. The evidence accumulates over the following 48 hours. Rochefort's unease transformed into something approaching dread as he documented what was invisible rather than what was visible. On December 6th, he compiled a list for his own files, not for official distribution. Item 1. Japanese carriers had maintained regular radio communications throughout October. By early November, that traffic had fallen by 80%. By late November, it had ceased entirely. Item 2. Japan had changed naval call signs on November 1st, unusually early in the regular 30-day cycle. Then they changed them again on December 1st. Rochefort had never seen call signs changed twice in a single month. Item 3. The level of encryption in what little Japanese naval traffic remained had increased dramatically. Messages that would have been sent in lower grade codes 3 weeks ago now required the highest level cipher systems to decrypt. Item 4. When Rochefort's team did manage to decrypt recent messages, they found unusual references to training exercises in home waters and special preparations, without specifying location or purpose. Item 5. Japanese diplomatic traffic between Tokyo and Washington had increased by 200% in November. The embassy in Washington was receiving messages of such length and complexity that the decryption was taking the Japanese diplomats themselves several days. He showed none of this to Kimmel. The admiral wanted certainty, and certainty required evidence of action, not evidence of absence. The fact that Rochefort couldn't locate the carriers only meant they were maintaining radio silence, a routine security measure. It didn't mean they were steaming toward Hawaii across 3,000 miles of empty Pacific. That would be madness. Wouldn't it? The northern route. What Rochefort could not know, could not see from his basement cipher room, was that on November 26th, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 support vessels. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the strike force from the carrier Akagi. He carried with him Admiral Yamamoto's meticulously detailed attack plan, a document that specified target priorities, approach vectors, and weapon assignments for every single aircraft in the operation. The plan called for a northern route, far from commercial shipping lanes, through waters where winter storms made observation unlikely. The fleet would maintain absolute radio silence. Any vessel that encountered them would be destroyed before it could transmit a warning. On December 5th, that policy was tested. The task force, now just 400 miles north of Hawaii, encountered a Soviet transport ship, the Uritsky. The vessel was loaded with American-built tanks bound for Vladivostok under the Lend-Lease program. Through binoculars, Japanese lookouts could see crew members on deck. The crew could undoubtedly see them. Every gun in the Japanese fleet trained on the transport. Nagumo's standing orders were explicit: destroy any witness. But Nagumo did not give the order to fire. The Uritsky represented a diplomatic problem more complex than a tactical threat. Japan and the Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact in April. Destroying a Soviet vessel would shatter that agreement at a time when Japan needed to avoid a two-front war. Moscow had to be kept neutral, while Japan struck south. Nagumo watched the Uritsky continue toward Vladivostok. He noted the incident in his log, but did not break radio silence to report it to Tokyo. Later, some intelligence analysts would theorize that the Soviet transport did indeed radio a report of the encounter, and that Moscow deliberately chose not to pass that information to Washington. Stalin, the theory went, wanted America in the war against Germany. A Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would accomplish that goal while keeping the Japanese occupied in the Pacific, unable to attack Siberia. Whether that radio transmission happened, whether Moscow made such a calculation, would never be conclusively proven. What mattered was the result. The Uritsky reached Vladivostok, and Nagumo's fleet sailed on undetected. The Dawn Watch. At 3:50 in the morning, on December 7th, the United States Coast Guard patrol ship Condor, sweeping the approaches to Pearl Harbor, spotted something unusual in the water. The duty officer called it in as a periscope submerged submarine bearing 035. The destroyer USS Ward, patrolling the harbor entrance, received the report at 3:57. For the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, Ward searched the area without contact. At 6:37, Ward's lookout spotted the periscope again, this time less than 50 yards away. The submarine was attempting to follow the supply ship Antares through the submarine nets into the inner harbor. Ward's captain, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, had assumed command of the destroyer less than 48 hours earlier. This was his first combat decision. At 6:45, he ordered his gun crews to fire. The 4-inch guns fired twice. The first shot missed. The second struck the submarine's conning tower at the waterline. Ward then dropped depth charges in a pattern around the area where the submarine had disappeared. Oil and debris rose to the surface. At 6:53, Outerbridge sent a message to the 14th Naval District headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message was logged, evaluated, and forwarded up the chain of command. At 7:40, a phone call was placed to Admiral Kimmel's office, reporting the submarine contact. Kimmel's duty officer took the message. He noted that the harbor entrance had been active all morning with scheduled ship movements. Submarine contacts in the past had often turned out to be whales or debris. Protocol required investigation and verification. The duty officer made arrangements for a patrol aircraft to investigate the Ward's report. By the time that investigation began, the first Japanese bombs were already falling. The radar signal. At 7:02, 2 Army privates manning the mobile radar station at Opana Point on Oahu's northern shore noticed something unusual on their oscilloscope. Private Joseph Lockard, the more experienced operator, saw a signal larger than anything he had encountered during training. "Hey, look at this," he said to Private George Elliott. The signal showed a large formation of aircraft, bearing 033, distance 137 miles, approaching from the north. This was extraordinary. The radar equipment was new, installed only that month. The morning patrol was supposed to end at 7, but Lockard wanted to give Elliott more training time. They had kept the equipment running while they waited for the truck that would take them to breakfast. Elliott thought they should report the contact. Lockard agreed. At 7:06, they called the information center at Fort Shafter. The switchboard operator who took the call found only one officer present. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, on his second day of duty at the information center. Tyler listened to the report of a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. He knew that a flight of B-17 bombers was scheduled to arrive from California that morning. The bombers were approaching from the northeast. The timing matched. "Don't worry about it," Tyler told the radar operators. Lockard and Elliott shut down the radar at 7:45 and waited for their ride to breakfast. The signal had closed to within 20 miles. The first wave commander, Mitsuo Fuchida, led the first wave of 183 aircraft from 6 carriers. His formation included 40 torpedo bombers, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters. Each pilot had spent months training for this specific mission, practicing shallow water torpedo drops and precision bombing runs. At 7:49, Fuchida reached the northern shore of Oahu. Below him, the island was peaceful. No fighters rose to intercept. No anti-aircraft fire challenged his approach. The element of surprise was complete. At 7:53, Fuchida transmitted the code that signaled success. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The first bombs fell at 7:55, targeting the airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Ford Island. Rows of American aircraft, parked wing to wing to prevent sabotage, were destroyed within minutes. Some pilots never left their quarters. Some reached their planes, but found them already aflame. At 7:58, the torpedo bombers reached Battleship Row. The battleships were moored in pairs along the southeast side of Ford Island. Nevada was moored alone at the northern end. Arizona and Tennessee were paired. West Virginia and Maryland were paired. Oklahoma and California were moored separately in positions that left them fully exposed to torpedo attack. The Japanese torpedoes, modified with wooden fins to run in the harbor's shallow 40-foot depth, were catastrophically effective. Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in rapid succession on her port side. Within 12 minutes, she rolled completely over, her hull rising 30 feet above the water. 429 men were trapped inside. West Virginia took 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs. She settled upright onto the harbor bottom, her main deck awash, but did not capsize. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, was mortally wounded by shrapnel on the bridge. He remained at his post, giving orders until he died. At 8:06, a single bomb, a modified 16-inch battleship shell dropped from 10,000 feet, struck Arizona's forward deck between turrets 1 and 2. The bomb penetrated through multiple decks and detonated in or near the forward ammunition magazine, which contained more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder for the 14-inch guns. The explosion was visible 30 miles away. A fireball rose nearly 500 feet into the air. The forward part of the ship disintegrated. The blast and subsequent fire killed 1,177 of the 1,512 crew members aboard. Arizona sank in 9 minutes. The second wave. The second wave arrived at 8:54, consisting of 167 aircraft, 54 high-altitude bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 35 fighters. By this time, American anti-aircraft defenses were fully active. The sky over Pearl Harbor filled with shell bursts and tracer fire. Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, attempted to escape through the harbor channel. But the Japanese dive bombers concentrated on her, recognizing that if she sank in the narrow channel, she would block the entire harbor. Nevada took 5 bombs and 1 torpedo. Her captain, realizing the danger, deliberately beached her at Hospital Point to keep the channel clear. Pennsylvania sat in dry dock, vulnerable to dive bombers, but protected from torpedoes. She took 1 bomb hit that killed 31 men, but remained operational. California sank slowly, settling into the mud with her superstructure still above water. Maryland, protected by Oklahoma's hull, took only 2 bomb hits. Tennessee, trapped by Arizona's wreckage, took 2 bombs but remained afloat. By 9:45, the second wave had departed. American anti-aircraft guns continued firing at anything that moved in the sky. 3 American fighters that had managed to take off and engage the enemy were shot down by friendly fire when they attempted to land. The count. By 10 o'clock, the sky over Pearl Harbor was clear. Admiral Kimmel walked among the wreckage along the waterfront. Fires still burned on Arizona. Oklahoma's hull, a dark red expanse of barnacled steel, rose above the water like a monument to capsized dreams. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the harbor, turning the water black. Bodies floated in that water. The casualty reports arrived throughout the day. 2,403 Americans were dead. 68 of those deaths were civilians in Honolulu, killed by American anti-aircraft shells that fell back to Earth. 1,178 were wounded. The ship count was grimmer. Of the 8 battleships in harbor, 4 were sunk: Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California. 4 were heavily damaged: Nevada, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee. 3 cruisers were heavily damaged. 3 destroyers were destroyed. 4 more destroyers were damaged. 6 auxiliary vessels were sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. 159 more were damaged. The Japanese losses were minimal by comparison. 29 aircraft shot down, 5 midget submarines sunk. 64 Japanese servicemen died in the attack. But Kimmel, walking among the ruins, began to notice something peculiar about what the Japanese had not destroyed. The discovery, 3 days after the attack, after the fires were extinguished and the immediate casualties treated, Navy damage assessors began systematic surveys of Pearl Harbor's infrastructure. Captain Homer Wallen led the salvage survey. His job was to determine what could be saved, what was lost, and what the Navy still possessed. His first report contained a startling finding. The Japanese had not touched the fuel storage tanks. Above Pearl Harbor, in the hills surrounding the base, sat massive above-ground tanks holding 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, the entire reserve for the Pacific Fleet. A single bomb on any of those tanks would have caused an explosion visible from space. The resulting fire would have consumed the entire reserve, making Pearl Harbor unusable as a naval base for at least a year. The Japanese had not bombed the tanks. Wallen's survey continued. The dry docks, the machine shops, the electrical generating plants, the supply warehouses, all were intact. The Navy Yard facilities could repair ships at full capacity. The harbor itself was undamaged. The channel was clear. Most remarkably, the Navy's submarine base was virtually untouched. 22 submarines were present during the attack. 21 survived without damage. Within weeks, they would begin offensive operations against Japanese shipping. And there was one more revelation. perhaps the most significant. The carriers were not in port. Enterprise was at sea, returning from a mission to deliver aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was at sea, delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing maintenance. The three carriers that would become the backbone of the Pacific Fleet's response were safe. Kimmel reviewed these facts in his office at the Pacific Fleet headquarters. The building's windows looked out over the harbor, across the black water toward Ford Island. He could see Arizona's shattered superstructure breaking the surface. He began to understand what Admiral Yamamoto had accomplished, and what he had failed to accomplish. The strategic vision. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the damage reports from Nagumo's fleet with mixed feelings. The attack had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating losses on the American battleship force. By the traditional measure of naval power, the number of capital ships, the United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled. But Yamamoto, unlike many of his colleagues in the Naval General Staff, did not measure power by battleships. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had traveled extensively across America, seeing its industrial cities, its oil fields, its shipyards. He understood American industrial capacity in a way few Japanese officers did. Before the attack, he had told Premier Fumimaro Konoe, "In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." The Pearl Harbor attack had bought him 6 months, perhaps 12. But the American aircraft carriers had escaped. The fuel reserves remained intact. The infrastructure survived. Most importantly, the attack had transformed American public opinion from isolationist to enraged. Yamamoto had been asked to design a war plan. He had delivered a perfect tactical operation. But he knew tactics were not strategy. He had said it himself. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. They were not. Japan had no plan to invade the United States. The Pearl Harbor attack assumed that America, shocked by the losses, would negotiate a settlement that recognized Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. That assumption was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American character. Yamamoto knew this. He had told his colleagues. But he was a military officer, bound to carry out the policy set by civilian leadership. So he had designed the perfect attack, and he had executed it flawlessly. And now he waited to see if his worst fears about what came next would be realized. The counterfactual Vice Admiral William Pye, commander of the battle fleet, faced a different realization in the days after December 7th. He had kept the battleships in port because he believed any Japanese threat would develop in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. His decision meant the battleships were sitting targets for the air attack. 5 of his 8 battleships had been sunk or disabled. But as the days passed and the salvage assessments came in, Pye began to understand what would have happened if he had been wrong in a different direction. If he had believed Pearl Harbor was under threat, if he had ordered his battleships to sea to avoid being caught in port, they would have been sailing without carrier air support when the Japanese attack came. The Japanese carriers, designed for exactly this kind of engagement, would have found them in open water, far from any aid or support. In the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, 5 battleships had sunk or capsized. But the water was only 40 feet deep. The ships settled onto the bottom with their superstructures above water. Salvage was possible. Already, repair crews were working on plans to refloat California, West Virginia, and even Oklahoma. Nevada had been beached, not sunk. She could be repaired. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee had never lost power. If those same ships had been attacked at sea, they would have sunk in waters thousands of feet deep. There would be no salvage, no repair, no return to service. The United States would have permanently lost half its Pacific battleship force on December 7th. Instead, within 18 months, all but Arizona and Oklahoma would be returned to active service, many with upgraded anti-aircraft defenses and radar systems that made them more effective than they had been before the attack. Pai wrote none of this in official reports. But in a letter to a colleague dated December 20th, he included this observation. A disaster at sea would have been final and irrecoverable. What happened at Pearl Harbor, as terrible as it was remediable. Our ships can be raised. Our men can be replaced. Our fuel remains. Our carriers escaped. The Japanese taught us the importance of air power at the exact moment we needed to learn it, and at a cost we could afford to pay. The embassy. In Washington, at the Japanese embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura faced his own revelation about timing and consequences. The Japanese Foreign Ministry had transmitted the final portion of a 14-part message breaking off negotiations with the United States. The message was to be decoded, translated, and delivered to Secretary of State Cordell Hull precisely at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on December 7th, 30 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor was scheduled to begin. 30 minutes was enough time to satisfy international law. Japan would formally declare the end of negotiations before military action commenced. The attack would be a surprise, but it would not be a violation of diplomatic protocol. But the decoding and translation took longer than expected. The message was complex. The embassy's decryption equipment was slow. The typist was not as fast as planners in Tokyo had assumed. The final message was not ready until 2:05 in the afternoon, Washington time. By then, the attack had been underway for more than an hour. By the time Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu were ushered into Hull's office at 2:20, the Secretary of State had already received initial reports from Hawaii. Hull read the Japanese message with deliberate slowness while Nomura and Kurusu waited. When he finished, he looked at the two diplomats with, as he would later recall, a depth of anger he had rarely felt. "In all my 50 years of public service," Hull said, "I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. Infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them." He gestured toward the door. "You can go now." Nomura and Kurusu would later claim they had no knowledge the attack was underway when they delivered the message. Whether that was true or false became irrelevant. The timing meant that Japan had committed what President Roosevelt, in his address to Congress the following day, would call a date which will live in infamy. A surprise attack with no declaration of war. The distinction between a 30-minute warning and no warning at all, between a technically legal surprise attack and an illegal sneak attack, seemed minor in military terms. But in political terms, in the court of American public opinion, it was everything. The transformation. The United States that went to war on December 8th, 1941, was not the United States that had existed on December 6th. On December 6th, America was sharply divided. The isolationist movement, led by the America First Committee, commanded millions of supporters who believed European wars were not America's concern. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, gave speeches arguing that Britain had already lost and American involvement would be futile. Opinion polls showed that 75 to 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. Congress had extended the military draft, Summer draft, in August 1941 by a single vote. 203 to 202. The margin was 1 vote. America was that divided, that close to refusing even basic military preparedness. December 7th changed the calculation completely. Within hours, the isolationist movement collapsed. The America First Committee voted to disband. Lindbergh fell silent. The December 6th question of should America go to war was replaced by the December 8th certainty of how shall America prosecute this war? On December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech lasted 6 minutes. He asked Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. The Senate vote was 82 to 0. The House vote was 388 to 1. The single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into World War I. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan, declared war on the United States. Congress reciprocated the same day, again with near unanimity. The United States went to war unified in a way it had not been since the War of 1812, and in a way it would never quite be again. The scapegoats Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short, the commanders at Pearl Harbor, were relieved of duty 10 days after the attack. A presidential commission, convened immediately, found them guilty of dereliction of duty. They had failed to adequately prepare their forces for attack. They had not maintained adequate aerial reconnaissance. They had not placed anti-aircraft guns on full alert. They had allowed ships to be concentrated in harbor and aircraft to be bunched on airfields. 8 more investigations would follow over the next 4 years, reaching similar conclusions. Kimmel and Short had information suggesting heightened Japanese threat levels. They had failed to act on that information with sufficient urgency. Neither the Presidential Commission nor any of the subsequent investigations found fault with the intelligence services that had lost track of the Japanese carrier fleet. Neither investigation questioned the assumption that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan for a carrier strike. Neither investigation addressed why American military planning had not seriously considered the vulnerability of battleships to air attack, despite the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940, a full year earlier. Kimmel and Short became the explanation. If they had been more vigilant, the disaster could have been prevented. The fact that no aerial reconnaissance patrol pattern could have covered all approaches to Hawaii, that even full anti-aircraft readiness might not have prevented the attack given the overwhelming surprise, that the battleships were obsolete before the first bomb fell. These considerations were subsumed into the simpler narrative of command failure. Both men retired from service in disgrace. Both spent the remainder of their lives seeking exoneration. Short died in 1949, Kimmel in 1968. Neither lived to see their names partially cleared by a Senate resolution in 1999, which stated that while they had made errors of judgment, they had been denied vital intelligence that might have altered their decisions. The Department of Defense never accepted the Senate's finding. The official position remains unchanged. Kimmel and Short failed in their duties. The salvage. The work of raising and repairing the sunken battleships began within days of the attack. Navy salvage teams, led by Captain Homer Wallen, faced challenges unlike any previous Marine salvage operation. The scale was unprecedented. The urgency was absolute. The Navy needed those ships. Oklahoma proved the most difficult. Capsized completely, with her starboard side resting on the harbor bottom and her port side rising 30 feet above water. She required a salvage method never before attempted. Engineers designed a system of 21 massive winches anchored to Ford Island. Cables attached to the hull would slowly, over months, rotate the entire ship upright, using her own keel as a pivot point. The work began in March 1943 and continued until June. Over 95 days, the winches pulled. Oklahoma slowly rolled. The hull rose from the water. When she was finally upright, pumps drained her compartments. The bodies of 243 sailors, entombed for 18 months, were recovered and identified. Oklahoma was too badly damaged to repair. She was decommissioned and eventually sold for scrap. But the salvage proved it was possible to raise even a completely capsized battleship. Knowledge that would be valuable in future operations. California and West Virginia were refloated by March and April 1942 respectively, repaired at Pearl Harbor, then sent to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for complete reconstruction. They returned to service in January and September 1944, with upgraded armor, new anti-aircraft batteries, and modern radar systems. Both participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where they engaged Japanese warships using the same 14-inch guns they had carried on December 7th. Nevada, beached during the attack, was refloated in February 1942, repaired, and returned to service by October. She participated in the Normandy invasion, bombarding German positions at Utah Beach, then sailed to the Pacific to participate in the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns. Arizona alone was truly lost. The explosion that destroyed her forward magazine had broken her back. The hull cracked in multiple places. Oil still leaked from her fuel bunkers 70 years later. She remains in Pearl Harbor, a memorial, her hull visible just beneath the surface. Of the 8 battleships present on December 7th, 7 returned to service. The 8th became a monument. The disaster that seemed absolute on that Sunday morning proved to be substantially recoverable. The carriers. The deeper irony of Pearl Harbor emerged not in what was destroyed, but in what survived and how it survived. The Japanese plan targeted battleships because Japanese naval doctrine, like that of most navies in 1941, assumed that battleships were the decisive weapon in naval warfare. The 8 battleships in Pearl Harbor represented America's main battle force in the Pacific. Destroying them would give Japan naval superiority for the critical first months of the war. But the 8 battleships in Pearl Harbor were not America's main battle force in the Pacific. They were the obsolete remnants of a previous era of naval warfare. Their maximum speed of 21 knots was too slow for modern carrier operations. Their primary weapons, 14-inch and 16-inch guns, had effective ranges of 20 to 25 miles. Japanese carrier aircraft could attack from 200 miles away. The 3 American carriers that escaped destruction, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, became the foundation of the Pacific Fleet's offensive operations. Within 6 months, those carriers would halt the Japanese advance at the Battle of the Coral Sea and devastate the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway. The attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed America's faith in battleships at the exact moment that battleships were becoming strategically obsolete. It forced the Navy to rebuild its Pacific strategy around the very weapon systems the Japanese attack had validated. The Japanese won a decisive tactical victory that accomplished a strategic revolution favoring their enemy. Admiral Yamamoto understood this irony. In a letter to a colleague dated December 20th, 1941, he wrote, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Our task now is to win the war before that resolve manifests in material form. I am not confident we have time." The turn. The decisive turn came 6 months later at a small atoll called Midway, roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. In early June 1942, Admiral Yamamoto led a massive fleet, including 4 fleet carriers and more than 250 aircraft, to capture Midway Island. The operation would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, and Yamamoto hoped draw out the remaining American carriers for a climactic battle that would end the Pacific War. The Americans intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had replaced Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway. He knew the Japanese were coming. He knew their strength, their approach vector, and their timing. On June 4th, American dive bombers caught 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck, refueling and rearming. In 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally wounded. Hiryu launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but was herself located and destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Japanese Navy. The United States lost 1 carrier, 145 aircraft, and just over 300 men. The Battle of Midway was decided by American intelligence that decoded Japanese plans, by American admirals who had learned to use carriers aggressively, and by American pilots who had developed effective tactics through 6 months of desperate combat following Pearl Harbor. It was also decided by Japanese strategic assumptions that underestimated American capacity to recover from December 7th. Yamamoto's 6-month window of superiority closed at Midway. After June 1942, Japan was strategically on the defensive for the remainder of the war. The production. What Yamamoto had feared, what he had warned his superiors about before the war, what he had hoped 6 months of victories might prevent, began to manifest in American shipyards by mid-1942. The United States entered the war with 7 fleet carriers. 3 survived Pearl Harbor unscathed. By August 1945, the United States Navy had built 99 carriers, 27 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and 63 escort carriers. The Essex-class fleet carriers alone, 24 ships commissioned during the war, displaced more tonnage than the entire Japanese carrier fleet at its peak. American shipyards, applying mass production techniques developed for automobiles, reduced the time to build an escort carrier from 2 years to 90 days. Kaiser Shipbuilding delivered 70 Liberty-class cargo ships in a single year from a single shipyard. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a new vessel every hour of every day. Aircraft production followed the same pattern. In 1941, the United States produced 26,000 military aircraft. In 1942, that number rose to 47,000. In 1943, 85,000. In 1944, 96,000. Total American aircraft production during the war, 300,000 planes. Japan, with its smaller industrial base and limited access to raw materials, could not match these numbers. Japanese aircraft production peaked at 28,000 planes in 1944, then declined as American submarines cut supply lines and American bombers reached Japanese factories. The industrial disparity Yamamoto had feared was absolute. America produced nearly 3 times as much military equipment as all Axis powers combined. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its industrial capacity was terrifying in its scale. The lesson. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemura signed the Instrument of Surrender, ending World War II. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, accepted the surrender. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had commanded Pacific Fleet operations from his office overlooking Pearl Harbor since December 19, 1941, signed as the United States representative. He stood on Missouri's deck, surrounded by other officers who had been there at the beginning, who had witnessed the disaster that started the war. Behind him, barely visible through the morning haze, rose the peak of Mount Fuji. Before him spread Tokyo Bay, where the Japanese fleet had once anchored, now empty except for American and Allied vessels. The war that began with a surprise attack on battleships in harbor ended with atomic bombs dropped from strategic bombers, weapons that didn't exist in 1941. The battleship era had ended. The carrier era had peaked and was already giving way to submarine and air power dominance. Military technology had evolved faster in 4 years than in the previous 40. Japan's strategic gamble had failed completely. The attack that was meant to intimidate America into accepting Japanese dominance in Asia had instead unified America, validated carrier warfare, exposed battleship vulnerability, and triggered an industrial mobilization that buried Japan under an avalanche of ships, planes, and weapons it could never hope to match. The irony was profound. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent American interference in Japan's expansion. The attack accomplished exactly the opposite result. It transformed America from a neutral, divided country with isolationist tendencies into a fully mobilized, unified, war-making power, focused exclusively on Japan's unconditional surrender. Yamamoto had been right in his original assessment. Unless Japan could march its armies to Washington and dictate terms, war with America was unwinnable. Pearl Harbor made that war inevitable while making its outcome certain, the memorial. 75 years after the attack, the USS Arizona Memorial receives nearly 2 million visitors per year. The white structure spans the sunken battleship's hull, which remains visible beneath the clear water. Oil still rises from Arizona's ruptured fuel bunkers, creating an iridescent sheen on the surface, called the Tears of the Arizona by those who maintain the memorial. Inside the memorial, a marble wall lists the names of 1,177 crew members who died when the ship exploded. A separate room lists the names of survivors who chose to be interred with their shipmates after their own deaths, their ashes placed inside the wreck during underwater ceremonies. The memorial sits in the middle of an active naval base. Sailors work on ships visible from the memorial's windows. Aircraft carriers enter and leave Pearl Harbor, passing within a few hundred yards of Arizona's grave. The irony is deliberate. The memorial commemorates a disaster that occurred in a base that is still operational, still projecting power, still fulfilling the mission the attack was meant to destroy. Visitors stand at the memorial's rail, looking down at the rusted hull beneath the water. The question they ask most frequently, according to the park rangers who staff the site, is always the same. How could they not see it coming? The question assumes that the attack should have been obvious, that the evidence was there, that someone should have known. The assumption carries within it a deeper assumption, that disasters are always preventable if only people are vigilant enough, smart enough, prepared enough. But Joseph Rochefort, in the basement of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, watching his map develop blank spaces where carriers should be, could not see what was coming, because what was coming had never happened before. No one had ever launched a carrier strike across 3,000 miles of ocean against a fortified harbor. The precedent didn't exist. The playbook hadn't been written. And even if Rochefort had known, even if he had convinced Kimmel, even if every ship had been at full alert and every aircraft had been airborne, the Japanese would still have achieved surprise. The carriers were 6 months away. The fuel reserves were untouched. The industrial base was untouched. America was going to war against Japan, and America was going to win. The only variable was how much warning they had, and how many sailors died on that Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor was not a failure of intelligence or vigilance. It was a revelation of the new reality of warfare in the industrial age, where massive forces could project power across vast distances faster than defenders could mobilize, where yesterday's decisive weapons were today's targets, and where the outcome of the battle was less important than the transformation it forced upon the victor and the vanquished alike. The memorial commemorates the sailors who died, but the lesson it teaches is about what they died proving. That surprise matters less than resilience, that tactics matter less than strategy, and that the initial conditions of conflict matter far less than the sustained will and capacity to see that conflict through to its conclusion. The carriers weren't in port that Sunday morning. The fuel remained. The Navy adapted. The giant awoke. And the attack that was meant to intimidate became the spark that transformed the entire course of the 20th century.